This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Plain Talk Live. Talking with me now will be Bo Wood. He's a political science professor from the University of North Dakota. And we're going to be talking about some themes, some topics that are very much in the news right now. Obviously, the battle over the law in Georgia has a lot of people's attention, including the Major League Baseball. They decided to move their All-Star game out. They've moved it to Colorado, which some have pointed out Colorado actually has more restrictive laws in some ways than the state of Georgia does. So that's interesting. But also there's a larger theme where we have sort of big corporations that are coming in, and I don't want to say it because it's not like in the past we talk about corporate interference in politics, and a lot of times that's corporations interfering because they want less regulation, or maybe they want lower taxes, or maybe they want some sort of, maybe it's like rent seeking, right? Some sort of subsidy or something from the government, and so they spend money and they hire lobbyists and they involve themselves in the political process. That way they make campaign donations. This is a different thing where you have corporations that are acting on policy areas that really aren't related to their core business. Something like Major League Baseball, voting laws really don't have a lot to do with baseball, other than obviously voting impacts us all. But it, as in terms of direct policy, really doesn't have a lot to do with baseball or Coca-Cola or Delta or any of these other companies that have been weighing in on this scandal. So I would say from that perspective, it's a relatively new thing, this sort of corporate involvement in politics, and I think distinct from what we usually talk about when we talk about corporate involvement in politics. So here to chat with me about that is, of course, my good friend, Bo Wood from the University of North Dakota. Professor Wood, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Glad to be here.
Well, glad to have you. And what do you make of this? I mean, I guess I described it as a recent trend. I think we could probably think of examples that go back years. But do you agree with me that this is what's happening now with these corporations getting involved in politics? It's distinct from my view, from what we've talked about in the past when we talk about corporate involvement in politics.
Well, yes and no. At the same time, there have always been companies that would get directly involved when any piece of legislation, impacted their bottom line, taxes, whatever, all the examples that you just used. There's also, though, if you look at it from the perspective of these guys being, these companies being sort of social justice warriors and feeling an obligation to use the weight of their company to promote ideas and policies and concepts that they find valuable or worthy, then you have to include all the fair trade things. You have to include Tom's shoes and the Bombas socks guys, and you have to include all of these practices that are not specifically about laws, but are trying to use the power that they have through their business to try to influence policy or try to shape the world. So in some ways, I think you're right. This breaks new ground because we've seen this with celebrities. We've seen this with athletes directly, with taking a knee, with all of these examples, people being very, very vocal and using those platforms. But it seems like it's only recently that we're starting to see CEOs of major corporations themselves officially taking a stance on a piece of legislation, and trying to change it.
It's interesting. Why do you think they're doing it? I mean, what's made them to make the calculus? Because when I think of a business, I mean, generally, whether it's Disney, whether it's Major League Baseball, whether it's Coca-Cola, I mean, generally these are enterprises that are organized to make money, right? And so that impacts their decisions. So these decisions, a lot of times they're making, does not have an obvious connection to profitability, other than, I guess, if if the public's calling them out, they run the risk of suffering their own boycotts, I guess, if they don't ask. But why are they acting? Why do you think that they're feeling like they have to get involved?
Yeah, I've been wondering that too, because you're right that it certainly stands the chance of alienating as many of their customers as it empowers. Um, it reminds me of. Do you remember when right after the when the Citizens United decision came out and the Supreme Court essentially allowed, sort of opened the door to super PACs and dark money and that sort of thing. There was a big controversy when Target contributed some money to some candidates, and then it came out that those candidates, I can't even honestly remember what the problem was with those candidates, which side they were on, but all I remember is there were people standing outside of Target stores with placards and protesting Target because they had jumped
Well,
into
it wasn't
politics.
it
And it
wasn't it
seems
a
like
it was a bathroom bill thing, wasn't it? Wasn't that the issue
I
at the
thought it
time?
had something to do with gender and that kind of thing, but I couldn't remember the specifics. And so, there's and I don't think they were taking a position on the bill. I think they got a separate. I think the bathroom issue was like another time where they sort of stepped in it. And I think the lesson you got to learn from these is that when you're talking about a company like Coca-Cola or Delta or Target, you've got an equal number of people that are of either political persuasion. You're gonna it feels risky to me, and so I have a hard time understanding what they're doing. Although I think you mentioned before that the most reasonable explanation is that they're worried about their own labor. They're worried about in sort of dissatisfaction among their own players, and I found that to actually be pretty compelling. So maybe you should talk
Yeah.
about that.
Well, there is if you're a baseball fan like I am, and I'm a huge baseball fan, as evidenced by my lovely Hank Aaron comic book art cover in the background. I love baseball. I bleed baseball, and by the way, I'm not boycotting Major League Baseball for making this decision because I'm just not into that. I guess as a conservative, if I boycotted every company or artist or author or whatever that had politics that were opposite from my own, it would have a very boring life. Because most of them just do. It's just a reality, I guess, of being a conservative. But if you follow baseball, you know that there's labor tension already between the players and management. A lot of it has to do with the current collective bargaining agreement. There's, and not to get too far into it for people who aren't baseball fans, but if you start looking at the free agent market in the last couple of years, it's really dropped, and the players aren't getting a lot of money. Some of the big teams aren't spending a lot of money. There's feeling among the players that there's collusion among the owners, and essentially the commissioner, Rob Manfred, works for the owners, that there's collusion among the team owners to sort of drive down free agent prices so that they can make, because obviously if the labor costs less, then the profitability for the team owners goes up. So there's already tension there. And there was a feeling that if Major League Baseball didn't act as a league or an enterprise in whole, that the players were going to take it upon themselves to act individually. And so now all of a sudden at the All-Star game, maybe you have some of the big name players decide that they're gonna stay. It becomes the kneeling thing like it was for the NFL
Sure.
all over again, where some of the players are gonna kneel, some of the players are not gonna like that the other players are kneeling. Some of the players are gonna feel pressure like they have to kneel, otherwise they're gonna be seen as throwing their teammates under the bus. It creates a lot of dynamics there, and I think Major League Baseball was, they got called out, right? The activists kind of called them out. Major League Baseball, I think in some ways, I think Manfred was taking one for the team. We'll act as a league instead of turning it into this, perpetuating problem where we have players opting out or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
to my mind, I wish we could just keep politics in its lane. And I say that obviously I work in politics for a living, and I think it's important, and I'm not necessarily against living your life in accordance with your convictions, right? I mean, a lot of times we think about this in the religious freedom debates where you have, like a Catholic business owner. And so can that Catholic business owner be forced to pay for health insurance, for birth control methods, or abortion or whatever that maybe they find immoral? And I think that applies with politics. I think you should be free to conduct yourself in your public life, your business life, your professional life in accordance with your politics as well. It just becomes tough because your politics isn't necessarily everybody's politics. And again, I think a lot of these businesses, I think Major League Baseball would like to just stage baseball games and encourage people
Yeah.
to attend and spend their money. I think Coke would like to just sell its beverages, right? I think Delta would just like to have people fly people around the country. I don't think they really want to get involved in playing, judge and jury on, what the Georgia legislature might get up to, or the Colorado legislature, or the North Dakota legislature, or what have you.
Well, I think your explanation is probably the best one that I've heard for that. I think it is more reasonable to think that this is a response to get out ahead of player frustration and exactly the kind of thing you described. But if that's true, then that suggests that the other companies, Delta, Coke, that those are going to be less likely. It's harder for me to imagine a bunch of Delta pilots deciding that, what, if Delta Airlines doesn't take a stance on this, we're going to stage our own sort of protest.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I haven't been following it closely enough to know what they've been doing, but if your logic is correct, then you would expect them to try to downplay it and distance themselves a little bit and hope it goes away.
Yeah, Delta State. I mean, these are Georgia-based companies, and I think really all Coke and Delta have done, and unless I've missed something, is kind of put out statements condemning the law.
Yeah.
And I think Delta even had to do two statements, where they did one, and then I guess some of the activists didn't feel like that was condemning enough, so then they had to do a second one, which was which was kind of interesting. To me, all of this has its roots in what I have described is what I think is probably the most populist era in American history. A lot of it driven by social media. And what I mean by that, populism, depending on how you use the term, can obviously mean a lot of different things. But I'm meaning it as in popular, sort of sentiment, right? I mean, the public opinion, what have you, the whims of the mob. I mean, whatever terms you want to use this, the hoi polloi, have more power than ever before. I mean, they can organize quicker. They can speak with a louder voice than ever before, thanks to the internet and thanks to social media. And a lot of this, that's where it's coming from, because it just becomes harder for people to ignore. But now it's like we're just being, and this is my point of view. It sometimes seems like we're being governed by internet mobs.
Oh, I agree. I think, there was the psychologists talk about cognitive dissonance, and they talk about how when you feel like you're an outsider, when you feel like everybody else feels a certain way about an issue and you don't, you feel pressure, internal pressure to resolve that and to bend your preferences to match what the majority, the mainstream think. And
That was
for so long,
the Milgram experiments, right? Didn't
yeah.
that kind of famously talking about
Um,
that? Stanley
I
Milgram.
thought Milgram. No, Milgram was the guy that made them shock to see whether or not they would
Yeah,
inflict pain and
but
shock people. Did he
but
do this one as well?
I think he did, where he would put people in the
Okay.
room and they would answer the questions wrong on purpose, and then the one person in the one room who wasn't in on it would feel pressure to give the wrong
Okay.
answer because they didn't want to be the one sticking out giving the different
The
answer
one
than
man, yeah.
everybody else.
All right. So the point I was making is that, when we had three major television networks, and those television networks were gearing all of their programming to the widest possible audience, there was a lot of pressure. If you watched those or you read a newspaper, there was a lot of pressure to conform your viewpoints with those views. And it was very difficult to find, if you were outside of that mainstream, it was pretty difficult to find other people that were thinking along the same lines, because you assumed everybody else was thinking along the same lines of what you heard on the television. So the internet has changed all of that. It has made it incredibly easy to, I don't care what you think. You could pick any belief structure that there is, and you can find within 5 minutes, you can find a group of people on this earth that agree with you, and that you have a body of shared belief. And that has made it really difficult to try to keep opinions in any kind of meaningful direction, in any sort of meaningful mainstream. It's almost eliminated the mainstream, and it has fed this idea of populism. It has made it possible for people to say, who think, those guys, those elites in Washington don't know what they're doing. Well, it is not hard to find people that agree with you on that point now. Easier now than it has ever been.
It doesn't reach a point though where I watched this documentary on Netflix, and I think it was Behind the Curve or something like that. Anyway, it was about the rise of the modern flat Earth movement, and they were talking about the number of people that grow. Let's be fair, it's still a very I don't want to give flat earthers more credit maybe than they deserve. It's still a very small movement, but there's no question that it's been growth. And even to the point where, you see a few celebrities every now. I think there was an NBA player, Kyrie Irving. I hope I'm not besmirching his good name if he wasn't the one, but came out and sort of questioned like whether or not the Earth was round. And so the documentary was following some of these, some of the most ardent activists and how they were trying to prove the scientific community was wrong. But one of the interesting points they made was how much easier suddenly it was for these people who believe this stuff to find one another and to organize and to promulgate their information, and then it becomes almost like a snowball effect. Be able to then recruit other people. So I'm watching that, and they were actually able to tie it to the proliferation of smartphones, where all of a sudden everybody got always on internet right in their pocket, where they could Facebook, they could Twitter, they could read websites, they can make posts, they can post videos, they can live stream, they can do all of those things relatively cheaply right from their pockets. And all of a sudden you saw flat earth theories taking off. And to me, I think it's a lot of things, right? You could tie that to
absolutely
the QAnon conspiracy, right?
Yeah.
That was at the heart of the attack on the United States Capitol. You could tie it to sorry, go ahead.
No, well, there was just let's see, I'm trying to find it here. There's a new Reuters Ipsos poll that came out, I believe, yesterday. That says, that talks exactly about that. 3 months after the mob stormed the Capitol, 6 in 10 Republicans still believe that it was either a largely nonviolent protest or was the handiwork of left-wing activists trying to make Trump look bad. And they believe that the election was stolen due to widespread voter fraud. I have not seen any credible evidence that would support that. And yet here we are multiple months later, and that belief continues to persist. And it continues to be substantiated and reinforced by these same kinds of groups. And I don't know how you break through that, because it's not like people are going to feel a compelling need to go out and fact check that. They don't believe the news media organizations that are telling them that it was, that there's no credible evidence, and largely because those news media organizations have proven themselves to be untrustworthy for a lot of those people.
Well, I can tell you, and I'm a conservative, no question about it. I have a long time conservative commentator in North Dakota, and I can tell you, I didn't buy when I saw people trying to claim that it was Antifa and it was a false flag, operation, and it was really just the left trying to set up the right by staging or instigating the attack on the Capitol. That was nonsense, and I've called it nonsense. And it's remarkable to me how many people just immediately, people who've been following me almost for decades now, almost for multiple decades, who've been following my work, who value it that much, who in just about any other way disagree with me, are immediately willing to write me off as some sort of a dupe for the liberal media. I heard that because I was hospitalized with COVID back in December, so I've had people suggest that I have COVID brain now, or that impacted my thinking. I've had people suggest that I'm my employers, I work for a foreign communications company, that my employers have gotten to me and they're telling me what to say or what to write, which is laughable. If anybody could see our internal stuff, nobody tells me what to do or what to write, at least what to say. But that's their theories. And it's just immediately because I'm not telling the story that they want to hear, then immediately I must be part of the conspiracy. Immediately I must be part of some plot to promote an alternative point of view that they don't like.
And so how do you debunk that?
I don't know.
How do we change that? How do you, to me, it seems like it has to be about restoring the credibility of, of the media. Well, I mean, the media themselves. But I mean, you're an example of somebody for whom there's been a long established trend of credibility with some of these viewers. And yet, in this one instance, when push comes to shove, you're cast aside. You're pushed to, tossed right under the bus because you're saying something they don't want to hear. That does not, you're kind of a walking example of what I had hoped would solve it. Credible journalists that people already have confidence in and already believe what they say, and that they would actually look at the evidence and say, no, look, you really need to believe me on this. This is it. It's nonsense. And I don't know what happens when you get to where, for every one person you've got that says it's nonsense, they can find, dozen of their friends that say, no, that he's, it really happened.
Well, that's what the internet's made possible, is if you don't like what Fox News is telling you anymore, then you can go find, or if you don't like MSNBC or CNN, if you don't like what the comment, you can go find somebody, whether it's on another cable broadcasting or another columnist or another, you could just go find somebody who will tell you what you want to hear. And in a lot of ways, we have sort of ceded control over where we get our information to other people. For instance, I don't read my Twitter feed, and I don't read my Facebook feed. Now, I post to these services because, let's face it, that's where the debate. I'm engaged in politics, and that's where the debate's happening, and so I'm putting my content there. And when people interact with me, I'll interact right back. But I don't read them because I don't want Facebook deciding for me what I'm going to read. Right? I don't want, like, if I click on one article and then Facebook's, oh, he really likes articles like that, so let's show him a whole bunch more of those. I don't want that happening necessarily. I want to make conscious decisions that, okay, I want to go and read more about this, and I don't want it to be Facebook, and I don't want it to be Twitter. I actually use RSS feeds, which is where I pick the feeds that are put out by the specific publications or the specific people that I want to follow, that I'm making a conscious decision to follow, and I'm not leaving it up to these third parties. But I think we have so much choice available to us and so much information available to us that you don't have to be confronted by things that are inconvenient for how you want to see the world. You don't have to be confronted by those things if you don't want to. You can avoid them entirely. And as a matter of fact, we have giant corporations that are organizing all this information for you that are more than happy to help you do that. And that, I think, more than anything else, is central to what's just killing us. And I don't know if that's me hatching my own conspiracy, if that's my own flat earth conspiracy, but that's how I see it. It troubles me deeply.
I do think there's at least a possibility. I mean, I'm troubled as well, but I do think there's at least a possibility. I know there was a time not so long ago when information was harder to come by, when the majority of people gave much, much less of their daily attention to politics. They had no choice but to trust the people that they elected to go to Washington to assess the information, or go to Bismarck, assess the information, and make the best choice possible. The idea of representative democracy was really all you had, because you couldn't. It was too difficult. Now there's so much information, especially the last 4 years. It has felt like every single person in America would wake up in the morning to see what had happened in the last, since they went to sleep, and was just hooked in. And I wonder, so far, for me at least, the Biden administration has been significantly more boring than the Trump administration was. And it is, there's a lot less of an impulse to check every single day to see what new thing has been done. And to the extent that that's the case, if people are willing to let that go and let that go, pay attention to other parts of their life, I'm not sure that that's a bad thing for democracy, because we cannot all be experts on every policy area. I mean, I try, you try, we devote a lot of time and energy to trying to stay up to speed on these things, and I still can't do it. I can't keep up with everything. So it makes me think, people with other interests that care about other stuff more than me, they have no choice but to take shortcuts and just listen to the talking heads that are telling them what they want to hear.
Yeah, it's my job. So I make a conscious. I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and the National Review. I'm a conservative, so these publications probably. I don't watch cable news at all, but Wall Street Journal, National Review, and some others that I'm slipping my mind right now. But I subscribe to those. But I subscribe to the New Yorker, and I subscribe to the Atlantic, and I subscribe to the New Republic because these are generally left of center. And I don't agree, or I don't want to say I don't like a lot of what I read there, but it challenges me, right? It challenges my worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of times I come out of it and I just feel sharpened, like I'm not necessarily persuaded, but I've at least exposed myself to those other points
Right.
of view. Now, we've gotten a little
You
bit off.
understand why you think what you think.
Right. And that's what I'm trying to do. Most people, and I fully understand, this is my job, so I can, most people don't have time for that. So they come home and they're cooking dinner for their kids and they flip on Fox News or MSNBC or something in prime time, or they get 5-10 minutes on their smartphone, so they start scrolling their Facebook feed, and that's all they have. That's all they have time for. And unfortunately, those sources are not good for you.
Yeah, you can't get a full picture in that time period.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily that there's anything wrong per se with Facebook, but if that's the only place that or Fox News or something or MSNBC, if that's the only place you're getting your information, you're going to have problems. We have a little bit of feedback from the chat room. Listener, and by the way, if you're joining this, if you go to inforum.com, you can find the link on any of my social media feeds. If you go to inforum.com, we have a live chat room, so while we're discussing, you can participate, you can put comments or questions there. Listener asks, corporations influence and to an extent even dictate our daily lives and lifestyles. Should they be held to a higher standard to be anti-racist, anti-homophobic, and just in general better? Bo, what do you think of that?
Well, I guess I would say that we've set up a democratic system. We've set up a representative democracy, and we set the rules by which society runs. And I think that's where we ought to be setting the standard. I mean, I suppose if customers want to vote with their feet and refuse to use a service or a product that is that's contrary or that they think is acting inappropriately, people have boycotted restaurants and hotels and those kind of places before because they were engaging in overtly discriminatory behavior. But I don't know. I feel like there's some dangers in setting that as an expectation. I think that's why we have governance. That's why we have legislatures. That's why we have regulatory bodies, that they have to reach a certain level of consensus in society, and then that becomes the standard. I worry about Twitter deciding which companies are good and which companies are bad.
Well, especially because when Twitter or Facebook or whatever, when we get these sort of reactionary mobs, and I'm not necessarily using that pejoratively because not all sorts of collective action are necessarily bad. I mean, sometimes a pile-on really is deserved because somebody did something awful. But the problem is sometimes it's not very thoughtful. And a lot of the people who are participating don't necessarily see the facts. I think now that Georgia has passed its law, and maybe people who live outside of Georgia, have been digging in a little bit and finding out more details about it, there's been some public polling, and we've seen maybe some backtracking by some of the loudest voices in favor of the boycott. So, for instance, one part of the Georgia law is an expansion of Georgia's current voter ID law to absentee ballots. Now in Georgia, like North Dakota and a lot of other places, you can get an absentee ballot for any reason. You can just ask for one. Some states you have to justify it, I guess, in some way. In Georgia, you don't have to. If you want one, you get one. But in the past, the way they verified those is through signature matching, which I got to think is not a very exact science. Now what they're going to do is you have to have an ID, and you put your ID's number on the ballot when you mail it in, and so that way they can verify it by the number. And I guess if they get more than one ballot per one number, or somebody uses an invalid number, then they know they've got maybe a problem with that ballot. most people, including one poll I saw, I think it was a SurveyMonkey poll, said, even a majority of Democrats, were in favor of that. Some of the stuff, the way it was described, oh, you can't give food or water to people standing in line. Well, most states have some sort of a provision like that where you can't give things of value to people who are standing in line. In fact, North Dakota has that law in the books. It's not worded exactly the same way as Georgia, but by my reading of North Dakota statute, if you started trying to hand out free hamburgers to people standing in line to vote, you'd be in trouble. That would be illegal. And you know what? I think it probably should be. Not that I want people to starve, and I don't want our voting lines to be long. I want you to be able to vote quickly and efficiently if you want to vote. But I don't really have a problem with saying, listen, we want to keep electioneering, even electioneering under the guise of handing out water, handing out food. We want to keep that stuff away from the polls. And so I think if people have had time to digest some of this, they realize that Joe Biden calling this, Jim Crow on steroids or whatever he used was ridiculous. And I don't even think Joe Biden believes that anymore, because recently he's been asked about the Masters, which is and I don't know much about baseball, is my thing, not so much golf, but I guess it's a big tournament that's going to be held at a big golf course, a famous golf course in Georgia. And now all of a sudden Joe Biden's not necessarily saying that the Masters should boycott Georgia, which doesn't make any sense, because if the laws in Georgia are Jim Crow 2.0, like he said, then why does Major League Baseball have to go, which he encouraged, which he supported, but all of a sudden the Masters can stay? Maybe the laws aren't Jim Crow 2.0, even if you find them objectionable, even if you think, they're not good public policy, which maybe I could understand, and that's certainly a debatable position. Maybe they could just be that and not the resurgence of Jim Crow.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. In fact, I think that what we're getting here a lot is this issue of trust. That there's people that I think are strategic actors on both sides of virtually every issue. And so, this law gets passed, and immediately it is, the provisions are exaggerated. So yes, it says no third party individuals will be allowed to provide food or drink to people standing in line. Okay. And they're essentially trying to stop people from, wearing union T-shirts and showing up and trying to shift the value or, shift people's opinions while they're waiting in line. But that's immediately interpreted to mean that we're going to make people, the idea is that we want people to not have any sort of refreshment or any sort of water, any kind of anything. So in the hopes that they will give up and go home, that they won't vote, that they won't be able to endure and stick it out. And I guess it saddens me that no matter what, and I mean, honestly, the same thing is happening right now with the infrastructure bill. The same thing happened with the COVID relief package. The same thing is happening everywhere, that the opponents immediately interpret it in the worst way possible, assume that the very worst will happen, and they deny the assumption that the people who actually passed the law had benevolent intentions, and that the whole thing was some sort of a strategic way to stick it to their opponents and gain a strategic advantage.
And we're also supposed to accept that the people complaining are doing so in good faith, that they're having an honest reaction to it, which I think in a lot, like you said, you called them strategic. I think that's right, where it's just sort of, okay, this is the position our side's taking, so now we're going to go into this sort of performative sort of politics where we make it seem, and we're just going to keep saying it until people believe it, I guess. And it's
the louder you say it, the more often you say it.
And the right does it too. I don't want to make it sound like I'm just saying only the left does this. No, it is endemic in politics. It's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, let's just look at all the discussions about how the raising the corporate tax is going to destroy the whole economy. I mean, it's the same thing. There are, is it possible? Yes. Is there some possibility that could actually happen? But they act as if it was the intention, if it was that was the purpose, that they hate America and so they want to destroy it. And I wish that more of the conversations could start from the assumption that these are, that the people who made these choices and started these things had the best of intentions, and let's try to understand what they meant and see what's the likelihood that it will work. And if there are flaws, let's work on fixing them. But instead of us versus them. And that has frustrated me more than anything, that we've really gotten into anything that benefits your side weakens my side, so I'm not going to support it.
Yeah, like we don't want to give the other side a win on anything, because that might be acknowledging that sometimes they have good ideas. And I mean, listen, nobody in politics has a monopoly on good ideas or bad ideas, as the case may be. One of the things that most bothered me, Bo, and this goes back years and years. The first time I think I really saw it, I think it was when George W. Bush was, and so it would have been very early in my career writing about politics. It was when George W. Bush was running for a second term in 2004. And I remember, this is the first time, maybe it happened before that, but this is the first time I remember seeing it. But there was some, and it just happened to be a left-wing group. And again, I'm not trying to focus on left-wing people or saying that this is uniquely to them, but it was a left-wing group, and they were encouraging people to withhold sex from their romantic partners, their spouses, their boyfriends, what have you, or girlfriends, or what have you, if until they pledge to vote for a Democratic candidate. And to me, that just seemed, I think at first people kind of laughed about it, joked about it. I think there were some of the late night hosts had some fun with it. But I think underneath that, you sort of see the beginning or of this attitude where it's like the other side is the enemy. Like even if it's somebody I know, somebody I love, somebody who I'm intimate with, that even they cannot be trusted if they don't have the right politics. And that I think is terrifying. And maybe my point of view on it's very different, because I do politics for a living, and so people want to engage me on, but they know what I do. They read my columns, they know what I do for a living, so they want to engage me on politics all the time. And most of the time it's great. I love talking about politics with people, but it's funny how often people have to come up and they sort of sheepishly say, I don't agree with you on everything. Like they're apologizing for that. Like that would be my expectation. Like I'm not going to like them if they don't agree with me on everything. And I always tell them, like, I always joke. Actually, I joke first and say, well, nobody's perfect. But I don't mean that. Why would you think it's a bad thing if you disagree with me on things? Let's have a conversation about it. And you know what? Neither one of us will probably change our minds, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I talked about that in some of my classes, the introductory class. I'll ask them, and one of the things that's striking is they're more polarized now than they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There's clear the days when students show up, even freshmen show up and have no idea whether they're a Republican or a Democrat. Those are kind of largely gone. I mean, most people, by the time they're 18 years old, they have some, political ideas formed. But what is interesting is you ask a show of hands, how many people in this class agree with everything that their party stands for? Wholeheartedly agree. And you get almost none. And it doesn't matter which party they're in. There are very, very few people that wholeheartedly believe across the entire, their entire side of the ideological spectrum. There's always some divergence and diversity, but we're not celebrating that. We're sort of punishing that. And that's the part that troubles me.
Yeah. I think it gets to, and I've talked about this in other live streams, it's in my writing a lot, that there are no, and we could get into this, because I want to talk a little bit about the filibuster and guns, which are two very related issues right now. But there are no, I think the thing is everybody thinks that there's like a finish line to this stuff, right? That we're gonna have some election is the election in which the other side is finally vanquished, and the people who think like you do are gonna be able to just, I guess, have their way and implement all the policies and all the social mores and everything else that they prefer. And it doesn't happen. And I think it's driving a lot of people nuts that it doesn't happen. I mean, when Donald Trump won the election in 2016, there were still tens of millions of people that voted for Hillary Clinton. And the Republicans had an obligation. I mean, those people didn't just go away. Right? When Joe Biden won the election in 2020, the tens and tens of millions of people that voted for Donald Trump and voted for Republicans didn't just evaporate. They didn't
And they didn't
disappear.
change their mind either.
Which is let's talk about, because there's obviously the filibuster's on life support in the United States Senate.
I think so.
It's hanging on by a thread. And I've always liked the filibuster. I realize it's not in the Constitution. It's just sort of the Senate rule. But to my mind, in the American system of government, the Senate is supposed to be the deliberative body. And right now, I think there are worse things than what amounts to an effective mandate that any piece of policy, and again, we've watered it down. We're passing things through budget reconciliation. We've nuked the filibuster for judicial appointments. So the filibuster ain't what it was already. And I also don't like that we don't make them talk anymore. I think if you wanted to filibuster, you should have had to get up and read the phone book or something, right? Like put some physical requirements on. Like, you actually have to filibuster. You really have to talk. I wouldn't mind that. But I don't. It amounted effectively to a mandate that you had to get some bipartisanship from the other side. You had to at least get some people from the other side onto your bill to get it through the Senate. I don't think that's such a bad thing.
I don't either. I think that I think you're absolutely right that compromise is the secret. The problem I find is that in recent years, the minority on both sides have used it as a way to require every single bill to have 60 votes. That if you cannot reach that 60 vote threshold, then, and neither party has had. I mean, the last time we had one party that had a filibuster proof majority, was 2008, 2009. Well, 9, 10, and that was unusual. It's in the modern era that is unusual. And so, as good as bipartisanship is, what we've got to ask ourselves is it better than gridlock? Because if the net result of requiring that 60 vote threshold means that nothing gets done, because nothing can surmount that 60 vote threshold, nothing can get bipartisan support. Even if you do manage to pick off one or two of the other party, you still don't have enough to overcome the entrenched obstruction of the minority. So, I guess I am of two minds of it. I think it is dysfunctional right now. I absolutely agree with you that compromise is the key, and that we've got to get out of the mindset of saying, well, you have to vote every vote with your party. But if you take that one step further, the reason why they do that is because if they don't do something like that, if they cross the aisle and cooperate with the other side, you can guarantee they're going to have a primary challenge that is more extreme than they are the next time they have to run for re-election. So in many ways, it goes right back to the voters themselves. If the voters would reward compromise, then they would compromise, and we wouldn't have the kind of gridlock that we have right now.
Well, like you said, like we've gotten to a point where they're using the filibuster so that every bill requires a vote, and a lot of people, as it functions in the Senate, essentially a bill gets 2 votes. First is the procedural vote, effectively the filibuster vote, which is it has to have 60 votes to proceed, right? And then if it passes that, then the ultimate vote that decides whether or not the bill passes the Senate is just a straight majority vote. Now, it used to be that a lot of senators would take a principled position saying, I don't agree with the bill, but I also recognize that the bill deserves an up or down vote, right? You've probably heard that. People say, I'll give it an up or down vote. What they're saying is vote to proceed, vote to end the filibuster. So a lot of times you'd see people on principle say, well, I'm going to vote to allow the bill to proceed, but I'm going to vote against it because I don't like the bill. Now, to me, that's a principled position. I'm going to allow the vote to happen. I'm not going to filibuster it. I'm going to allow the vote to happen because I recognize, the majority is the majority right now, and maybe I'm in the majority, but I'm going to vote against the ultimate bill. To me, that was a principled position. You do that now, and people are going to treat you like a traitor, right? Liberal, Republican, whatever you are, Republican, Democrat, they will treat you like a traitor.
There will be. You will have a primary opponent. That opponent will be funded by people that you thought were your friends, and they'll try to persuade your voters that you don't deserve to go back.
We have some input from Bob. He asks, should people not have party affiliations and vote according to laws that are trying to be passed? And I think what he's saying, like should people just be nonpartisan or whatever? And I don't know how you feel about this, Bo, but I don't think that that's possible right? I mean, I guess you could be nonpartisan in that you don't belong to a political party, and we've had people like that. Technically, Bernie Sanders, although he
Yeah.
that's a bad example, but because he's obviously campaigned for the presidency as a Democrat and caucuses with the Democrats. But we've had Angus Young from Maine is an example. We've had some independents. They're pretty few and far
We
in
have.
between. I don't think it's
I think it.
possible. I mean, everybody's going to have at least an ideology, right? And
Well, if you go back to the first Bush administration, I remember. Are you old enough to remember Bush Dukakis?
barely,
Were you paying attention then?
not really.
Okay, so
I was in high
one
school.
of
I
the
was in high school trying to get girls to date me.
All right. So one of the key things that came out of one of the biggest complaints voters had about the Bush Dukakis race is there's not a nickel's worth of difference between the two candidates. That that their positions were almost the same on virtually every issue, and that really, it didn't matter. They were, there wasn't enough division between them. And I think that was because during that era there was a lot of pressure to move towards the center voter, to try to capture that center voter. They were trying to get that center voter would be where you would win your elections. After George W. Bush won, and starting really in 2004, and I mean a little bit before then, but really you saw it in 2004. That was a base election, and they believed that, it doesn't matter if we can turn out every member of our base, we win. And partly because they thought John Kerry was a weaker candidate, and that he was going to be unable to turn out all of the not particularly reliable base for the Democratic Party, because he just wasn't that inspirational for them. And so they didn't bother to try to aim at that center candidate anymore. They were aiming directly at the red meat to their base. And a lot of elections since then have been kind of aimed that way. This last one was both of them were aiming right at their base. And so the poor people in the middle, they felt like whiplash. So I guess, in response to what the commenter says, I do think we have seen that in the past when candidates perceive that their pathway to winning is by capturing that middle. That's when you see them kind of both lean toward the middle, and you see a lot more uniformity in positions, not a lot of differentiation. And it could swing that way again. I mean, the number of independents versus the number of registered Republicans and Democrats has fluctuated a lot over the years. And I would hesitate to say that it won't go that way again. But you're absolutely right that in Congress, the institution of Congress is organized around party lines. So it would be really hard to structure committees and all the different kinds of assignments and things if you didn't have party affiliations. I don't see that happening, but I can see, maybe a majority of the voters, choosing to be independent or nonpartisan.
I think, again, that gets back to what the voters' expectations of the people we elect are. And a lot of times our expectation is they go in, they stick to some platform of ideas, and they refuse to compromise or refuse even sometimes. I think there's a certain amount of duty when you're in the minority, whether you're in the minority in North Dakota's legislature or you're in the minority in Congress or wherever. Sometimes you do have, I mean, you need to stick up for, I guess, what you believe in. But on the other hand, sometimes you do have to acknowledge the other side won. And to a certain point, after a certain point, they get to govern. Right? Like some of the stuff we do with like presidential appointments and stuff. Like Joe Biden's not my cup of tea. Donald Trump wasn't either, frankly, but Joe Biden's not my cup of tea. So I'm not necessarily going to like a lot of the people he wants to appoint to offices, but you know what? He's the president. He won the election. He gets to appoint, unless some of these people are just grossly unfit for the job, like they lied about their resume or they committed a crime or something, then we have a duty to appoint them.
Or if it's a cronyism,
right? Or yeah, category, like we're trying to appoint a relative or a friend. Yeah, like you're trying to appoint a campaign donor or something to a ambassadorship or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. That's the Senate's. But if it's just an ideological objection, you know what? Biden won. So he gets to appoint. And when we have a Republican president, he or she will have won. And they get to they get to appoint. So it's that unwillingness to accept that sometimes the other side gets to govern is part of the problem. But political parties as a concept are not a bad thing. I mean, and essentially in that they act as a sort of infrastructure that can, and especially in a sprawling sort of democracy like America has, where I mean, it's not just Congress and the presidency, but you're talking about state legislatures, you're talking about governorships, you're talking about statewide elected office. In what is a really a large country, both in terms of population and geographically, it lends itself to a two-party system. And so, to affiliate yourself with Republicans, you have to believe in some of the Republican platform. That's just a given. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. So that when you're doing a national campaign and you roll into San Jose or something, you have a local Republican Party that's putting up your yard signs for you, that's organizing rallies for you, that's raising money for you. I mean, those things are a given, and they're not necessarily evil or a nasty or a horrible thing. The problem is not political parties or partisanship per se. The problem is an unwillingness, and like to your point, Bo, I think it starts with the electorate, an unwillingness to acknowledge that when the other side wins, beyond a certain point, they get to govern.
I can understand their hesitation when it comes to Supreme Court justices. Anything that's a lifetime appointment, I can get it. I
Sure.
can get why you might want to take a principled objection because it's not going to just last this administration.
It's forever.
Otherwise, I agree with you. I also think another advantage of parties is that they allow people to find common ground. That it's sort of the big tent. If we didn't have parties, if everybody was just affiliated with a particular cause or issue that they cared about, there'd be a lot less opportunity for cohesion. And let's face it, there's the bundle of ideas that comprises the Republican Party and the bundle of ideas that comprises the Democratic Party. There's a lot of if you didn't have that organizing structure, a lot of those people wouldn't have anything to do with each other.
Let's talk guns now, because I think that's
okay.
It's an interesting topic for the filibuster and everything that we're talking about, because although right now I don't sense that we've had some recent shootings, obviously, and they've gotten some media attention. It hasn't reached like a Sandy Hook or some of these other high profile. We haven't reached that, so we've had so much other stuff going on. It feels like the political impetus or the outrage in this moment. But typically that's what happens. We have an event or maybe a couple of events, and it reignites the debate. Everybody kind of says the same old things that they've always said, maybe with some variations or whatever. We have the debate, and then not much happens. Joe Biden today issued an executive order, I think about background checks for ghost guns or something, and who knows? I mean, I suspect that'll probably be immediately challenged in court. Some sort of an injunction will be issued, and then like a year or so from now, a federal judge somewhere will settle the matter for us. But to me, that's an interesting where both sides are just kind of locked into their positions, and nothing really changes. We have the debate over and over again, but nothing really changes.
I do think that their proposals are getting fine-tuned. I do think I think the big reason why I don't disagree with what you're saying, that we haven't seen it really move to the forefront of the policy window. But I think the reason for that is I think the Biden team is more effective than previous administrations at keeping focused on whatever the main thing is. And, for them, the first main thing was pandemic relief, and they didn't let anything distract them from that. Now they're focusing on pushing this infrastructure thing through. And the border, I think the situation at the border is creeping in on that because they don't, it's hard to control that. That's as those numbers mount, they're having to divert attention in order to deal with that. But I think the guns, in the absence of something that is, we have become sort of numb to the kinds of mass shootings that have happened in recent days. And so it's there, and I do think it will make it onto Congress's agenda. But I expect to see gun control. I expect to see that become a hotbed after we get past the infrastructure bill. And I think there's one other one that they're doing that's like next on their plate. So I would expect to see it sometime summer, maybe fall, definitely before we ratchet up into the election cycle for the midterms, because I don't think they don't want to see that as a mobilizing principle for Republicans. But I think there's been enough momentum among Democratic circles that I think that it wouldn't surprise me to see movement on guns before they get to things like, student loan forgiveness, and or minimum wage, that kind of stuff.
Do you feel like because part of this is it feels like we're just I look at the gun problem to the extent that it is a problem, and I don't even see a gun problem. I see a people problem. I think this is another
Yeah.
issue. We just got done talking about why I think sometimes we tend to talk about the problems in our society as top down problems when a lot of times they're bottom up problems. So a lot of the issues with what we just got done talking about with partisanship and sort of intransigent politics starts with voters who vote for that. They want that. They want people to go to Washington and not compromise and just beat up on the
And
other side.
fight.
There's obviously a market for that. I wonder sometimes if the gun issue isn't the thing. Does America have an issue with gun violence because we have so many guns, or are Americans a violent people? And how much? And
Well,
this is actually from a left. Mother Jones is actually. You wouldn't expect a conservative to be citing the work of Mother Jones, but they've done a tremendous amount of journalism tracking the
yeah.
connections between modern shootings and Columbine, and giving I think a lot of credence. And there's been research that I've read about this as well, where a lot of times these shootings, and to the extent that they get just massive amounts of media coverage, and the politicians talk about them endlessly, and they go on, and it becomes almost endemic where they inspire more of the same. So if you have people who are disaffected, maybe they have a political cause, right? Because if you look at the shootings, there's always all sorts of different motivations. Sometimes it's clearly like some sort of mental illness. Sometimes there's a political cause. Sometimes there's like a social issue, like the attack on the Pulse nightclub in Orlando was clearly motivated by some animus towards homosexuals. There's been a lot of different motivating factors, but it's almost like we've turned the mass shooting into a medium. And so if you're angry or you're disaffected or you're mentally ill and you want to make a splash, that's the medium you
That's
work
where you
in.
go.
And to me, that's not a gun problem, that's a social problem.
I totally agree with that. I don't think that's going to stop them from passing
Well, no,
legislation.
probably not.
But I mean, I do totally agree with that. And I don't think that the proposed legislation that they're going to likely get. I mean, the thing is, the two things that they've got proposed are, closing the loophole for private sales, basically, unless it's your relative, unless it's a close relative. Basically, every sale, private or public, would have to go through an FFL and go through the background check. And there's like 80% support for that. And then the other one is extending the number of days that the NCIS has to process, a request. Right now, if it doesn't finish within 3 days, then they can proceed. But a lot of stores won't do it anyway. They won't, they will say we're going to wait until it happens. So that would increase it into 10 days. And neither of those are really onerous to most law-abiding gun owners. They're worried about the slippery slope, but neither of those are directly impacting. And I think those are the low-hanging fruit that, when it comes around to it, that will allow lefties to be able to say, "Yep, look, we did something. We're on it. We're making some progress. We finally had a victory against gun violence." I think it will have a marginal impact on the actual problem, because you're right. It's not addressing what's actually going on here. If people were using pickup trucks to commit these exact same crimes, I don't think we'd be talking about outlawing pickup trucks. But there's no reason why they couldn't. It's the tool that they're using is separate from the cause of the problem. I
Well,
mean,
and
I don't.
it speaks to, because in the post 9/11 era, the George W. Bush administration, Republicans got a lot of criticism, and I think rightfully so, depending on which circumstance you were talking about, for what was described as security theater, which was we're gonna implement policy that gives the appearance of making people safer, which really doesn't. The reality is, a free society like ours, where you could gather at a park, or you can gather at a baseball game, or you can line up outside a polling station to vote. A free society like that is inherently vulnerable, because we
Yes.
don't live in a police state, and nor should we want to. So there's nothing we can do. If somebody who wants to hurt a whole bunch of other people is always going to be able to find a way. And so I think what we've got to
What?
do is we've got to work on how do we identify people who are having problems and make resources available for them, to do it. And I mean, sometimes the mental health thing is a cop
Kevin.
out for Republicans that don't want to talk about this issue. But really, it's there, and it's not an easy thing. I think it's a lot easier to say, hey, let's ban this certain type of trigger, or let's have some really exacting new form of gun control on a type of gun that no mass shooter has ever used. But we're going to do this really ticky-tacky thing so that we can all say we did something and move on. It's a lot harder, I think, to say, listen, there are people in our society that are angry and disaffected or have mental illness problems or all three, and we're a vulnerable society because we're a free society, and that's not an easy thing to solve.
I don't disagree with anything, except I think you're maybe underestimating the value both to politicians and to society of the theater. That people wanted to feel safer, yeah, after 9/11.
Yeah.
People felt like the masks made them safer. I mean, yeah, there were a lot of people that were angry about that, and there were plenty of studies that said, the masks are not really effective, and but it made people feel like we were at least doing something, and it gave the politicians. If you're a politician and your choices are to stand in front of your constituents and say there is nothing we can do, you're going to just have to suck it up and deal with it because it's part of life. Or we've done these things. Here's what we did. And it may not solve the whole problem, but at least we're taking action. Which one do you think they're going to pick?
Yeah. As a conservative, I wish we could have a political leader one time that had the cojones to just stand up and say, you know what, the best solution here is nothing. Because sometimes I think that really is the best path forward. Is sometimes the government just needs to do nothing because there's no policy that's really going to make a difference. But we're up against our time. We had an hour. I thank you so much for your time. I can't wait to do this with you again. Final thoughts to you.
Yeah. Oh, I just had a blast. It was really fun. I think that we've hit on some really important things that if people think seriously about the value to the society of compromise and of working together and that's the way out. There is no way that either party is ever going to amass enough support that they can just dominate all of the institutions of our society and their policies will be implemented henceforth and forever. Neither one of them can consolidate power like that. So the alternative is that you've got gridlock or compromise.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting. I don't think we solved any of the problems, but I think we identified a few of them. We just got to get people to go along with them. Bo, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. These live streams will be with people like Bo, who I'm trying to pick smart, engaged people, and often people who don't agree with Rob Port on things. To have conversations with every Wednesday at 2. And, of course, if you subscribe to the YouTube stream, you follow me on social media, I'll be doing newsmaker interviews. We've done an interview with Lieutenant Governor about Coal Creek Station, did an interview with David Owen, a marijuana activist. Been doing a lot of those, so stay tuned for all those. Thanks for listening.